My homeland is in the Far East, a kingdom of honourable fighting men. And this sword yet awaits a true man to wield it.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman. I hope everybody's doing well. We've got something a little more obscure today. We're going to be talking about a little known country mentioned in a couple descriptions in Dark Souls 2. Well, mainly just the stuff that comes from this land, but we're going to talk about the land itself too. So this mysterious land in question is none other than Jugo, the homeland of our dear friend Benhart, and the extremely lovely Desert Sorceresses. So first off, Jugo is described as being east of Dran Lake. Like most of the other countries, I believe Mira is also mentioned as being in the east. It's said to be a desert kingdom ruled over by a king whose armor cannot be seen by cowards. The armor itself is quite unique and foreign looking, very pointy and whatnot. So this land was also inhabited by hordes and hordes of giant corrosive ants. And it was said that no matter which direction you looked while you were in Jugo, the horizon was lined by giant anthills basically as far as the eye could see. And unsurprisingly, ant larvae is considered a delicacy in Jugo, as seeking out such a rare and sought after, well, for lack of a better term, snack, often resulted in the melting of one's face once they entered the anthill in search of the larva. Melted to the bone, or so they say. But despite all this hype, we only really see one of these ants in the game. It's a queen, but it's down in the gutter in a little room by itself, guarded by a couple of those poison broomers. Now, if I had to do some theorizing, I would assume that this particular specimen was brought to Dran Lake by Aldia, who probably wanted to study it and find a way to weaponize its acid. And since it was specifically a queen, maybe he also wanted to try the delicacy that was ant larva. Anyway though, after conducting his research, he managed to develop a couple of these dragon-themed acid dispensers, if you will, that created a lake of corrosive acid in Dran Lake Tower, as well as turning one of the cells in his own keep into a makeshift acid pit to test the resilience of the hides of some of his monsters. Afterwards, Aldia presumably chucked the Ant Queen down the gutter, where she can still be found to this day. I think it's safe to assume that he wasn't too big a fan of ant larvae as a meal. Although it is worth noting that the acid that we encounter in the game is clearly much weaker than what's mentioned in the descriptions. I think it's possible that Aldia managed to alter or weaken this particular Ant Queen's acid production. Maybe he was specifically trying to create an acid that didn't affect skin and only destroyed weapons and armor. This would make potential interlopers have to strip down to nothing to cross these acid lakes, while potentially having to fight off attacks from the armed defenders of the castle. Well, either that or all of the corrosive acid descriptions were just trying to make Jugo sound a lot more terrifying than it actually was. But either way, a land filled with giant acid-spewing ants is going to produce some good warriors. And arguably the second best warrior in the game, second to Vengarl, Benhart, hails from there. We all know Benhart, good guy, fake sword, still useful, and a really great voice. In fact, he's sort of like the Desmond Hume of Dark Souls 2. You help him with a metaphorical and physical roadblock in his journey, he becomes an extremely useful and good friend, and you eventually meet him in a memory. I mean, it sounds like Desmond to me, but anyway. Benhart did come from Jugo, but he's wearing the outfit of a Mirish knight. Now, considering that he's been on a presumably long journey, I think it's safe to say that this wanderer stopped in Mira and wound up looting some armor while he was there, before he wound up in Dran Lake where we meet him. Now, alternatively, Benhart's gear could have been looted from Dran Lake as well, because we know there's quite a few expats from Mira who now call Dran Lake their home. So I suppose it's just as likely that he looted this Mirish armor out here. Anyway though, so Benhart is said to have descended from a long line of warriors. Now, it was believed that this long line's legendary swordsmanship was the result of the mythical blade that had been passed down the family like an heirloom. But since the sword doesn't have any actual magical properties and is in fact a replica of sorts of the true Moonlight Greatsword, that means that Benhart and all of his family members were the real deal, a true lineage of legendary swordsmen. And I think if nothing else, that alone gives Jugo a good name. They produce one hell of a family of swordsmen. Now that also reminds me that Jugo does bear some similarities with Karthus. I mean, perhaps it was one of the lands that would eventually become incorporated into what Karthus was. I mean, it's a desert, it's known for its swordsmen. That sounds a little bit like Jugo, although Karthus has no mentions of the anthills. But both places are known for their pyromancers, so maybe they are connected in some way. I tend to think so, but I just can't prove it. Anyway, though, I'm getting a little bit off topic. Benhart does have a Scottish accent, so that leads me to believe that perhaps this is the accent that comes from Jugo. But then again, I suppose if that were the case, then that means that Father Ariandel was from there too, and there's really nothing backing that up. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Scottish is not the accent of Jugo, but it is Benhart's accent. And as for Jugo's connection with the real Moonlight Greatsword, it's sort of up in the air. I mean, Benhart's clan seemed to think that their Blue Moon Greatsword was the real Moonlight Greatsword, so that does indicate some knowledge of the signature weapon of Seath the Scaleless. But how these legends wound up in Jugo is anyone's guess, I suppose. Perhaps Jugo is a land where some of his followers wound up after the whole changing of the cycles between Dark Souls 1 and 2. Or just legend had spread far and wide to a master craftsman who wanted to recreate the Moonlight Greatsword but with no magical properties, and he did, resulting in the Blue Moon Greatsword, which somehow wound up as Benhart's family heirloom. Perhaps his ancestor was one who forged it, or maybe he claimed it as his own, who knows. I do really wish we got the knockoff Moonlight Greatsword in other games, but it's one of the things that makes Dark Souls 2 unique in my opinion. One of the many things. I mean, here's this legendary sword that's basically synonymous with the Souls franchise, and it is in the game, but here's one that's sort of like a knockoff, one for non-magic players to enjoy. It hits like a truck, and really the only stat requirements are strength, if I recall correctly, and it potentially had a nice little story behind it. Not to get all faux pretentious or whatever, but in a way, the Blue Moon Greatsword sort of symbolizes Dark Souls 2. Anyway, though, I'll stop rambling. So now on to my favorite of the Jugo lore bits, the Desert Sorceresses. Now, I saved them for last because they'll probably be the thing that Jugo's most remembered for, as one of them made it to the end of the world. But before that, let's go over their origins, which admittedly are shrouded in mystery. So for some reason, before the events of Dark Souls 2, the Desert Pyromancers, or at least some of them, left Jugo. So since there's no definitive answer, we can speculate for a bit using the previous cycle's Pyromancers as a bit of an example. So the first Pyromancers followed the ways of a guy named Salaman, and Salaman was Quelana, the daughter of Chaos's first pupil. He taught the flame arts to others, and eventually pyromancy became somewhat widespread. However, due to the unique appearance of the followers of Grandmaster Solomon, they were driven into the hinterlands, eventually settling in the Great Swamp. Now, whether they were driven just based entirely on their appearance or their weird flame magic is sort of unclear, but I like to think it's a bit of a mixture of both. So in this cycle, the Desert Pyromancers were not blessed with a strange appearance. In fact, they were given these quite beautiful ones. Their words, however, were considered poison, and they were known to enthrall men, both willing and unwilling, to basically be their slaves. And sure, it can be argued that there was at times no magic involved in the seducing of these men into being their thralls, but as you can probably guess, the women of Jugo likely didn't take too kindly to this. And as you can imagine, this sort of behavior is exactly what gathers angry mobs together to drive witches from a land. In this case, though, I wouldn't be surprised if the mobs weren't entirely comprised of women. So I'm thinking that these desert sorceresses were driven from Jugo by the rest of the population for being treacherous witches. So even though the pyromancers of this cycle weren't given these ugly appearances, they still wound up distrusted and hunted because of what they did with their appearance. And so the desert sorceresses fled their homeland, eventually finding themselves in Dranlake. Here they eventually set up shop in Harvest Valley, enthralled a bunch of hollows to serve as their slaves, and began carrying out a mining operation. It's unclear what exactly they're searching for in the mines of Harvest Valley, but they seem to be the ones in charge over there. As for the ones in Earthen Peak, I can't really say if they're directly serving the Queen Mytha, but if they are, I like to imagine they're serving as magical advisors, like how old kings and queens of the fantasy genre often have a wizard or a witch advisor, or I guess they'd probably prefer the term sorceress, which is what these Desert Pyromancers are called in this one. And speaking of which, these sorceresses managed to catch the eye of King Vendrick himself. They're likely one of the eccentric guests mentioned in the various descriptions about the foreigners that he'd invited to Dranlake in an attempt to stave off the curse. People like the Mad Warrior, the Blacksmith Llewellyn, those Alon Knight Captain Archers, and just like them, he stationed the desert sorceresses that he recruited in the castle. One of the most interesting things, though, about these desert pyromancers is that they possess a number of pyromancies that aren't available to us. And they cast them with what appears to be a hand mirror, and that's pretty unheard of. Usually pyromancies are only able to be cast from a flame, so they've clearly adapted some refined form of using pyromancy that hasn't really been replicated by anyone else since. Although we see from their descendant Zoe that the art has effectively been lost by the events of Dark Souls 3, the ways and the style of the Desert Pyromancers hasn't. It also looks like the starting outfit for Pyromancers in Dark Souls 3 has incorporated a bit of the Desert Pyromancer's wardrobe into the leggings portion. The little burgundy skirt cape with the gold trim in particular. Perhaps that means that after the events of Dark Souls 2, but before the events of Dark Souls 3, the two schools of pyromancy at some point came together. I mean, it wouldn't be too hard to believe. There were remnants of the great swamp pyros still alive in Dark Souls 2. They were just found deep in the Shrine of Amana. Who's to say that the Amana pyros and the desert ones never found each other? I mean, it would make sense as to why we got one of the descendants of the desert pyros in Dark Souls 3. See, even in the Dreg Heap at the very end of the world, you will find the last descendant of the Desert Pyromancers, a young woman named Zoe. So even as the cycles went on and Jugo became nothing but a memory, and even the desert sorceresses themselves faded into obscurity, one of their descendants persisted on. And like her ancestors, Zoe possessed a true and singular beauty. But unlike her ancestors, her words weren't poison, and she would eventually become the unassuming queen of the feeble. Now, I really like this use of the term feeble because it brings to mind Straight of Olaphis. He referred to us all as a feeble cursed one at some point or another, and in a way I like to think that this description is saying that she became a queen to all of the lost souls and hollows of Dark Souls 2. Yeah, I know that is kind of corny, but still, it works for me. Anyway, though, she basically just walks the ruins of the earthen peak that's now been tumbled and covered with ash in the Dreg Heap, acting as a guardian to all of these lost souls that found themselves here. And as she patrols, she's usually flanked by 2 or more thralls. But these aren't thralls in the same way that her ancestors used to enthrall men. These were willing subjects, willing bodyguards for her, that chose to serve her, likely partially at least because of her beauty, but also because she was a kind and benevolent guardian to all of the things in this forgotten area. And sure, there's no mention in any of her descriptions of the land of Jugo, and I guess that makes sense, it's probably long forgotten by this point. But it's nice to know that there's at least one descendant of the land who made it to the Dreg Heap, or at least even into Dark Souls 3. And sure, while she doesn't use a mirror or a fan or whatever it is to cast pyromancies, she does have a symbolic pyromancy of her lineage, which is sort of a flaming fan, or hand mirror, that she uses to repeatedly swat at her foes, which is very reminiscent of the attack they used back in Dark Souls 2. But yeah, I was figuring this was going to be a shorter one. Let me know if I missed anything, but I think I got all of the Jugo stuff. Either way, I probably did still miss something. But as always, I hope you guys found the video at least somewhat amusing and enjoyable. And if you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about really obscure lore topics occasionally, then please consider subscribing. We just cracked 21. That's fucking amazing if you ask me, but no one cares about all that. Let's have our outro and then a couple final thoughts regarding the desert land of Jugo. Alright, so I just want to give a shout out to Minds Patch, which that's the extremely dope artist that's responsible for my avatar. They sort of inspired me, for lack of a better term, to make a video about Jugo, because there's a lot of stuff in Jugo that is really interesting, and a lot of it is stuff I really like Benhart and the Pyromancers. And yeah, maybe the sorceresses did dominate half of this video, but you know, still, they're the most interesting part. Either way, though, I wanted to thank them for giving me this idea, and we have a couple more short videos coming out. I got one on the Pursuer that I've been working on, I'm finally finishing, and another one about rats before I finally get to my Oblivion drug trade video, which is admittedly a little bit longer, but at the risk of rambling on any further, I'm going to let you guys go. I will see you guys soon. Be safe, and see ya.